Before we begin tonight, a quick thank you to Matt for suggesting this topic, and to everyone else listening right now. If you have a moment before this episode, please consider leaving a review on Spotify. It genuinely takes about 10 seconds, and it means the world to this channel. Okay, let's descend. There is a hill in Massachusetts where something ancient and terrible was built, and then slowly forgotten. Not forgotten the way towns forget old barns or overgrown cemeteries, but forgotten deliberately, purposefully, as though the people who once walked its corridors needed the world to stop asking questions about what happened inside. The building is gone now, or nearly gone, replaced by condominiums and manicured walking paths. But if you know where to look, you can still find the outline of what was there. The curve of the old foundation, the ghost of a corridor in the soil. And if you are very still, if you let the quiet of this story settle around you like fog rolling across a Massachusetts hillside at 2 a.m, you might begin to understand why some places resist being erased. Tonight, we are going to Danvers. Specifically, we are going beneath it. Act 1. The Hospital on the Hill. To understand what Danvers State Hospital became, you first have to understand what it was supposed to be, and more importantly, what it was never supposed to become. The institution opened in 1878 on a hilltop in Danvers, Massachusetts, originally called the Danvers Lunatic Asylum. Its architect, Nathaniel Jeremiah Bradley, designed it according to the Kirkbride Plan, a model of psychiatric care developed by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride in the mid-1800s that was, in theory, humane. The Kirkbride Plan held that the very architecture of a hospital could be therapeutic. Long radiating wings, abundant natural light, ventilation, open land for patients to walk, a staggered batwing layout so that no ward was directly adjacent to another, preserving a sense of privacy and calm. Kirkbride believed, genuinely and passionately, that a beautiful building in a natural setting could aid in the healing of troubled minds. What he built at Danvers was, by Victorian standards, something close to majestic. The central tower rose above the surrounding farmland like a cathedral spire. The stone walls were thick and pale, the windows arched and tall. From the road below, travellers would have seen it framed against the sky. Imposing, yes, but also dignified in the way that grand public institutions were meant to be dignified. A statement of civic responsibility. He promised that the state of Massachusetts would care for its most vulnerable. That promise did not hold. By the early 20th century, Danvers State Hospital, it had been renamed in 1895, was already beginning to strain at its seams. The patient population for which it was designed was somewhere around 600. By the 1930s, the population had nearly tripled. Wards designed for privacy and calm now held double and triple their intended number of patients. The long, light-filled corridors that Kirkbride had imagined as healing spaces became crowded, dim, and perpetually loud. The staff-to-patient ratio collapsed. The ideal of dignified, individualized care became logistically impossible. What replaced it was something far darker. Electroshock therapy, introduced into American psychiatric practice in the late 1930s, became common at Danvers within a few years of its adoption. Patients were restrained, sedated, and subjected to electrical currents passed through the brain. The theory was that the induced seizure would somehow reset the disordered mind. The reality for many patients was amnesia, confusion and terror. Insulin coma therapy, in which patients were driven into a hypoglycemic coma through insulin injections and then revived, was practiced alongside electroshock. Hydrotherapy, prolonged submersion in hot or cold water, sometimes for hours, was another standard treatment. And then there were the lobotomies. The prefrontal lobotomy, developed by Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz and aggressively popularised in the United States by Walter Freeman, arrived at institutions like Danvers in the 1940s. Freeman's transorbital approach, an ice-pick-like instrument inserted above the eyeball and into the frontal lobe, could be performed in minutes without a full surgical theatre. It was sold as a cure for the most intractable psychiatric conditions. What it produced, more often than not, was a permanent alteration of personality. Patients became passive, compliant. The wildness and suffering were replaced by a dull, flat calm that administrators sometimes mistook for recovery. Walk the wards of Danvers in 1950, and you would have found a population that was, in the most profound sense, abandoned. Men and women who had arrived in psychological distress and found themselves trapped in an institution that had long since ceased to treat them as individuals. Some had been admitted for conditions we would not recognise as mental illness today: homosexuality, moral insanity, postpartum depression, the vague category of nervous exhaustion applied generously to women who inconvenienced their families. They had come seeking help and found instead overcrowding, restraints, experimental procedures, and a bureaucratic system that had no mechanism for releasing them, even when they improved. This is the world into which our story descends. A real world first, a documented world. Before we go further into the dark, it matters that you understand. The horror of Danvers was not invented. It did not require a conspiracy. The institution as it existed was already a catastrophe. But something else was happening there too. Something beneath the overcrowding and the institutional neglect. Something that operated on a different level entirely. And to find it, we need to go underground. Act 2. The tunnels. Every large psychiatric institution of the Kirkbride era had tunnels. This is not unusual, not sinister in itself. Danvers was no exception. Beneath the sprawling complex of buildings ran a network of underground passages originally constructed for entirely practical purposes: steam heating lines, maintenance access, and the transport of supplies between buildings during the brutal Massachusetts winters. When the ground was frozen solid and snowdrifts made outdoor movement difficult, staff could move between wards without stepping outside. Food could be transported, laundry, medicine. It was infrastructure, utilitarian, unremarkable, and largely invisible to the patients above. But the tunnels at Danvers were not simple. They were extensive. Far more extensive than the official maintenance map suggested. Former employees, in interviews conducted decades later during historical preservation efforts, described sections of the tunnel network that did not appear on any map they were shown. Passages that led to areas they had never accessed above ground. Doors that were sealed not with padlocks or conventional hardware, but with what appeared to be institutional-grade barrier systems. Heavy frames, bolted from the outside, lacking any visible interior mechanism. The working explanation was always the same: storage, older infrastructure, areas decommissioned and sealed for safety reasons. The tunnels were old, the institution was constantly evolving, and it was not unusual for passages built for one purpose to be closed off when that purpose became obsolete. Nobody pressed the question. Nobody had particular reason to, except for the cold, or multiple maintenance workers, interviewed independently over the years, noted the same thing. In certain sections of the deeper tunnel network, particularly in the areas beneath the original Victorian-era foundation, the temperature dropped noticeably below what the surrounding passages maintained. Not the ordinary variation of underground spaces, something more pronounced. A sustained chill that made certain sections feel, in the words of one former worker quoted in a 1982 local newspaper feature on Danvers, like going into a different building altogether. No one officially explained the temperature differential. The facility's engineering staff attributed it to variations in the steamline routing and older sections of the tunnel that lacked adequate insulation. That explanation was accepted. No one suggested an alternative, but the cold was noticed, and for at least one person, the cold was the first thread he pulled. Act 3. Thomas Hale. His name, in the accounts that have surfaced across various discussions of Danvers State Hospital's unofficial history, is given as Thomas Hale. He was a young orderly who began working at the institution in the early 1950s, a slight, quietly observant man in his mid-20s who had taken the hospital job because it paid reliably and was within walking distance of the rooming house where he lived. He had no particular background in psychiatry. He had served briefly in the military, had some high school education, and possessed what his supervisors apparently described as a good temperament with difficult patients. He was calm. He did not rattle easily. For his first year at Danvers, Hale worked primarily in the male admissions ward, one of the more active and difficult assignments, processing new arrivals, helping with intake procedures, managing the disorientation and sometimes the violence that came with first admissions. He learned the rhythms of the institution quickly, who the senior nurses deferred to, which physicians were kind and which were indifferent, which patients needed particular attention, and which were stable enough to require only routine monitoring. He was good at his job. He was promoted to a position that gave him broader access to more of the facility. It was that broader access that first revealed the anomaly, he could not stop thinking about. The patient transfers began, as best as Hale could later reconstruct, sometime in the early to middle part of his second year at the institution. Not dramatic transfers, not the kind that required full staff mobilisation or significant documentation. Quiet ones. Late night or very early morning movements of individual patients from certain wards, particularly from the ward housing the most severely agitated or psychologically deteriorated patients, to a location that was never specified in any paperwork Hale could find. He noticed because he was a careful man. He noticed which patients were in which beds at the end of his shift, and sometimes, working an early morning rotation, he would find a bed empty that had been occupied when he left. He would look for the transfer notation in the chart, the standard documentation that should accompany any patient movement, and find nothing. Not an error or an incomplete entry, nothing. The chart would simply reflect the patient's previous status, with no record of any change, and by the next day, the patient would sometimes be gone from the ward entirely, their name removed from the active roster, no discharge paperwork, no transfer documentation to another facility, simply gone, in the administrative sense, as if the bed had always been empty and the person who occupied it had never quite existed in any official capacity. Hale began keeping his own notes, not formally. He was not reckless, but quietly, in a small notebook he kept in the breast pocket of his uniform. Dates, ward numbers, patient names he could recall, times of observation. It was not an investigation. It was the instinct of an orderly man confronted with disorder he could not account for, trying to impose some structure on what he was seeing. What he was seeing, he would eventually come to understand, was the intake process for Ward C. ACIST 4. Ward C. No official documentation of a Ward C exists in the publicly available records of Danvers State Hospital. The standard ward designations used at the institution during the mid-20th century followed a conventional administrative numbering system, with some wards additionally designated by their population type, the women's chronic ward, the male admissions ward, and so forth. There is no standard ward in the facility's known history that carried the letter designation C. The name, in the accounts that reference it, appears to have been informal, staff shorthand, passed by word of mouth in the lower level areas of the institution, used quietly by the small number of employees who worked near or had incidental knowledge of the restricted section. It was not used in any document. It was not spoken in administrative meetings. It existed in the way that institutional knowledge always exists in large facilities, sideways, in fragments, passed from one careful voice to another without any official acknowledgement. What Thomas Hale eventually pieced together, through careful observation, through the occasional overheard conversation he was never meant to hear, and through the one time he followed a late-night transfer far enough to observe where it terminated, was this. Somewhere below the main level of the hospital, accessible through a section of the tunnel network that was locked and supposedly decommissioned, there was a separate operational space. Not a conventional ward, not a medical facility in any standard sense. A space that had been modified, insulated, equipped with specific infrastructure, to serve a purpose that was not psychiatric care. The patients who were transferred there were not transferred back, or when they reappeared in the general population, and some did, Hale noted, occasionally, they were different in ways that were difficult to describe. Not differently medicated, not recovering from a procedure in any observable sense, quieter, more inward. Their eyes, according to Hale's later account, had a quality he could only describe as having looked at something for a very long time. They did not speak about where they had been. Most of them, Hale came to believe, had been told not to. ACIT 5. The men in civilian suits. It is 1953. The Cold War has settled over the United States like a permanent weather system, present in every institution, every government office, every military and research facility. The Soviet Union has tested its first nuclear weapon. The Korean War has ended in a tense armistice. Senator Joseph McCarthy is at the height of his power, and the fear of communist infiltration, of hidden enemies within American institutions, has produced a governmental and intelligence apparatus that is simultaneously more powerful and more secretive than anything the country has previously maintained in peacetime. Against this backdrop, the Central Intelligence Agency launches what will eventually become one of the most extensively documented secret programs in American history, MKUltra. The program, officially approved by CIA Director Alan Dulles in April of that year, is a systematic effort to develop techniques for behavioural manipulation, mind control, and psychological coercion. Its methods include the covert administration of LSD and other psychoactive drugs to unwitting subjects, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and various forms of psychological torture. The program operates across dozens of institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, and military facilities, under a complex network of front organisations and indirect funding channels specifically designed to obscure the CIA's involvement. Danvers State Hospital, in the accounts that have accumulated around its history, is not named in the officially declassified MKUltra documentation. This is not surprising. The 1973 destruction of MKUltra files, ordered by CIA Director Richard Helms, eliminated the vast majority of the program's operational records. What survived was recovered largely by accident, in files that had been misfiled in a financial records room and thus escaped the shredders. Those surviving files documented 150 distinct research projects at dozens of institutions. The number of institutions from which documentation was destroyed is unknown. What Thomas Hale observed beginning in approximately 1954 was not men in military uniform. It was not government vehicles marked with any official designation. It was men in plain civilian suits, unremarkably dressed, carrying locked aluminum cases, who arrived at Danvers in unmarked cars, entered through a staff entrance that was routinely cleared of other personnel during their visits, and departed without signing any visitor log that Hale could subsequently locate. Their visits correlated with what Hale characterised as reliable frequency, with the patient transfers towards C. The hospital administrator during this period, a man Hale describes only as the director in his account, appeared, in the weeks following the first civilian visits, to have acquired access to funding for new equipment. Physical modifications were made to sections of the lower facility. Certain staff members, previously assigned to general ward duties, were reassigned to restricted areas and instructed not to discuss their new responsibilities. They received small, unexplained pay increases. They signed papers that Hale was told were standard confidentiality agreements related to sensitive patient information. They were not standard confidentiality agreements. The official explanation offered to the general staff for all of this activity was the same phrase, repeated whenever questions arose: behavioural rehabilitation research, a grant-funded academic collaboration, nothing that would affect daily operations, nothing to concern yourself with. Hale concerned himself with it anyway. Act 6. The fragments. There is a particular quality to knowledge acquired through fragments, through doorways not fully closed, through words heard at the end of a corridor, through documents glimpsed before being turned over. It is not the clean, linear knowledge of a direct briefing or an official report. It is more like the knowledge you have of a foreign city from photographs and other people's descriptions. Real, genuinely informative, but assembled from pieces that don't quite fit together seamlessly, that leave gaps where the most important details might be hiding. This is the knowledge Thomas Hale assembled over the course of the next several years. The first fragment came through a partially open office door on a Thursday afternoon. Two men he did not recognise. Neither was the civilian-suited visitors he had seen before. These were men in white coats, academic-looking, carrying folders, were speaking in what they believed was an empty corridor. Hale, turning into the corridor from a stairwell, stopped before they saw him and remained still. He heard 11 words clearly before one of the men pulled the office door shut. Those 11 words were cognitive breakdown thresholds, memory destabilization, and the point at which identity separation becomes irreversible. He wrote them down that evening in his notebook, unsure what they meant. The second fragment came 6 weeks later, from a nurse who had briefly been reassigned to the restricted section, and then, without explanation, reassigned back to general duty. She did not speak directly to Hale about what she had seen, but she spoke to someone else in Hale's vicinity, in the kind of careful, half-coded language that people use when they want to communicate something they are not sure they are allowed to communicate. What Hale gathered from her conversation was that the patients in the restricted section were not receiving standard psychiatric treatment. They were not receiving any recognisable treatment at all. They were being observed. They were being measured. Their responses to specific, controlled stimuli were being recorded with a precision and interest that, in her words, didn't match anything in the books we were trained with. The third fragment came from a document. Hale had been asked to deliver a sealed envelope to an office in an administrative wing he rarely visited. The envelope was not sealed when he picked it up. A clerical error, apparently, the flap merely tucked rather than glued. He did not open it. But when he set it down briefly on a surface to adjust his grip, a single page slid partially free. The page contained a numbered list. He saw 3 items before he quickly replaced the page and resealed the envelope as carefully as he could. The 3 items he saw were Protocol for Extended Sensory Occlusion, Baseline versus Post-Protocol Memory Recall Differential, and Threshold Documentation, Perceptual Anchoring Failure. He did not know what perceptual anchoring failure meant. He was beginning to understand, in the general sense, what they were doing down there. They were not treating mental illness. They were studying how the mind breaks. Act 7. The Design of the Darkness. To understand the experiments described in the accounts that have accumulated around Danvers, it helps to understand the scientific and geopolitical context in which such experiments were being conceived and conducted across the country during this period. The Cold War had produced within the American intelligence and defense community a specific and profound anxiety. What would happen to an American soldier, or intelligence officer or civilian official, subjected to enemy interrogation techniques designed to break the will and extract information? The Korean War had introduced the phrase brainwashing into American public discourse, applied to reports of American prisoners of war who had made statements sympathetic to their captors. Whether those statements reflected genuine psychological transformation or simple coercion under duress, they had ignited a fear within the national security apparatus that the human mind might be more vulnerable than anyone had previously assumed. The research that followed, not just at Danvers according to the conspiracy accounts, but across the network of institutions that fed into the M-Culture umbrella, was animated by 2 parallel imperatives. The first was defensive. Understand how enemy psychological techniques might work so that American personnel could be trained to resist them. The second was offensive. Develop those techniques, or better ones, for American use. In Ward C, the methods documented in the fragments that have emerged, through Hale's account, through the testimonies of former staff members, through the fragmentary physical evidence discovered by urban explorers decades later, appear to have centred on sensory manipulation, the denial of sensory input and the overwhelming of it, the disruption of sleep, the administration of experimental pharmacological compounds whose precise identities remain unknown, but whose effects, based on patient descriptions from the few who were later able to speak about their experiences, suggest combinations of dissociatives, hallucinogens, and compounds designed to heighten suggestibility and impair short-term memory formation. The isolation protocols were, by any modern standard, extreme. Patients were placed in individual rooms with no windows, no natural light, and carefully controlled acoustic conditions. Not silence exactly, but a precisely managed sonic environment. A low, continuous hum at frequencies chosen to prevent the brain from establishing reliable auditory anchors. Periodic audio playback of repetitive phrases or tones, delivered at intervals and volumes calibrated to prevent habituation. The goal, as best as can be reconstructed from the available fragments, was not simply to disorient. It was to bring the patient's perceptual system to a specific state, a state the research documents apparently referred to in the fragments that have been recovered as threshold proximity. What threshold? That is where the story begins to move in a direction no one anticipated. Act 8. The shared visions. Among the most disturbing and most discussed elements of the Danvers conspiracy accounts is what the surviving fragments refer to as the convergence phenomenon. It does not appear in any official psychiatric literature. It was not the intended outcome of the Ward C research program. It emerged, or was discovered depending on how you read the available evidence, as an anomaly that the researchers initially dismissed, then became increasingly unable to ignore, and ultimately found either so disturbing or so significant that it became the central focus of their work. The phenomenon was simple in its description, and profoundly unsettling in its implications. Patients who had been subjected to the sensory deprivation and pharmacological protocols in Ward C, patients who were housed in separate rooms, who had no contact with one another, who were in many cases so psychologically deteriorated that complex communication would have been impossible even if contact had been permitted, began describing the same things, not similar things, not the kind of overlapping hallucination content that might be expected from patients subjected to the same pharmacological compounds, The generic imagery of trauma and distress. The same things, specific things. A particular corridor described with consistent architectural detail. Low ceiling, smooth grey walls, a slight downward grade, lights recessed in the ceiling that provided illumination without any visible source. A figure at the end of that corridor, tall, stationary, featureless in most descriptions, though a small number of patients included additional details about posture and proportion that matched across their accounts with a specificity that the researchers found impossible to attribute to coincidence or suggestion. The observation rooms, patient after patient describing in their post-isolation interviews, before the memory suppression protocols made interview data increasingly difficult to collect, a sense of being watched from behind glass. Rooms adjacent to their isolation chambers, visible only as a reflective surface from within, behind which something was present. Not necessarily the researchers, though the researchers were, of course, observing from behind one-way glass. Something additional, something perceived through the glass at an angle, or from a direction, that did not match the actual observation room layout. And the symbols. This is the detail that appears most consistently across the accounts, and that is most difficult to explain away. Patients in isolation, given no drawing materials as a matter of protocol, found means to mark their walls. With fingernails, with the edges of fingernails worn down to nothing, with whatever residue from their skin or hair could be worked into the surface, and produce markings that, when the isolation chambers were cleaned between patients, proved to match, not approximately, not in the way that all human beings might independently produce similar marks under similar stress, matching in their specific arrangement, in the particular geometric relationships between elements, in a quality that one of the researchers, in the fragment of a memo that has become perhaps the most referenced document in the Danvers conspiracy literature, described as impossible to attribute to cultural transmission given the complete isolation of the patient population. The researchers had a problem. The problem was not that their experiments had failed. The problem was that their experiments had produced a result they were not equipped to explain. C-9, patient 47. She arrived at Danvers in 1956. The accounts consistently refer to her as patient 47, which appears to be a research designation rather than a ward number, suggesting she'd been identified and catalogued by the Ward C research program, rather than by the institution's standard administrative system. Her actual name has not surfaced in any available documentation. What has surfaced is a partial research profile, recovered in the 1990s from a collection of papers that had been stored in a private home in rural Massachusetts after being removed from Danvers by a research assistant who had worked there briefly in the early 1960s and had kept the documents without knowing their significance. She had been admitted following what the admission documentation described as acute psychological trauma following personal loss, a phrase vague enough to cover any number of circumstances. She was in her early 30s. She had no previous history of psychiatric treatment. She was, by all accounts, calm upon admission, functional. Her responses during initial evaluation were coherent and contextually appropriate. Whatever had brought her to Danvers had not, at the point of her arrival, broken her perceptual connection to the world around her. That connection, in the research accounts, becomes the central subject of the files relating to her. When she was subjected to the isolation protocols, something different happened. Where other patients deteriorated, became catatonic or agitated, retreated into incoherence or repetitive behaviour, she remained present, clear-headed, responsive. Her post-isolation interviews, according to the research profile, were articulate and detailed in a way that no other patients had been. She described her isolation experience with the calm precision of someone describing a journey they had recently taken and were still processing. She used spatial language, directions, distances, relative positions of features that implied a coherent mental map of whatever she was perceiving during isolation. And then she began describing things she could not know. The accounts of what she said range from the specific to the extraordinary. On the specific end, she described, in the post-isolation interview following her third protocol session, a conversation that two researchers had conducted in a room on the other side of the building earlier that day. She gave partial quotes. She described the physical arrangement of the researchers in the room, who was seated where, which one was writing, which was standing. Her account, when checked, was accurate in every verifiable particular. On the extraordinary end, she described, with apparent calm and in considerable detail, procedures that were scheduled for other patients in other rooms, procedures that had not yet occurred at the time of her interview, that were confirmed only in the records of sessions conducted in the days following her description. She described, in physical terms, the precise layout of rooms she had never entered, and that she had no possible means of having seen. The researchers' responses to this, as documented in the surviving fragments, range from clinical to alarmed. The lead researcher, identified in the documents only by an initial, R, became, according to the accounts, increasingly focused on patient 47 to a degree that appeared to concern his colleagues. He extended her protocol sessions, he modified the pharmacological compounds she received, he began conducting private interviews with her that were not logged in the standard research record, and he began asking her, with increasing specificity, about the room beneath the tunnels. ACE 10, the room beneath. She had mentioned it first in her fourth post-isolation interview, unprompted at the end of her response about the corridor and the figure she had described. Consistent with every other patient's account, she had added a detail that was not in any other patient's account. And below that there is a room, older than the rest. The walls are different there, and it has been there longer than the hospital. The researcher had asked her to describe it further. She had described a circular or near-circular space, low ceiling, stone construction, not the brick or poured concrete of the tunnel sections, but cut stone, assembled without mortar in a manner suggesting significant age. A floor that was lower than the surrounding tunnel grade, accessible by a short descent, and in the centre of the room something she described with careful hesitation. The quality of the air, she said, a density, as if the space itself had a weight that was not physical. It is where the barrier is thinnest, she said, in the account that has been most widely cited. I do not know what it is a barrier between. I only know that in that room it is almost possible to see through. No official documentation of any such room exists in the architectural records of Danvers State Hospital. The original building plans, the renovation records, the maintenance surveys, none reference a circular stone chamber beneath the tunnel network, but there is a detail in the local historical record that gives the accounts pause. Danvers is not just the site of a psychiatric hospital, it is the former site of Asylum village, the original community at the centre of the 1692 Salem witch trials, before that community was renamed and reorganised. The land on which Danvers State Hospital was built was occupied by European settlers for more than 2 centuries before the hospital's construction, and by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before that. The hill itself has a name in some of the older local histories that does not appear on any modern map, a name that translates, roughly, from the Algonquian of the regional tribes as the place where the ground is not still. The older maintenance workers at Danvers, the ones who had worked there long enough to know the tunnel system intimately, did not, according to Hale's account, deny the existence of the lower chamber when he carefully and obliquely asked them about it. They did not confirm it either. They changed the subject. One of them, an older man who had been at the institution since before the war, looked at Hale with an expression he described as the look of someone who has decided, a long time ago, not to think about something, and then walked away without speaking. Act 11, the descent. Thomas Hale accessed the restricted section of the tunnel network in the spring of 1958. He had spent months identifying the pattern of staff presence in the lower level corridors, who was there, when, and for how long. He had identified a window of approximately 40 minutes on Sunday mornings, when the restricted access corridor was unmonitored. He had found, through careful observation, and one piece of extraordinary luck involving a misplaced keyring left briefly on a hook near the maintenance office, the specific key that opened the first locked door in the sealed corridor sequence. He did not go all the way to Ward C. He was not certain, at that point, exactly where Ward C was in relation to the tunnel network. What he found in the restricted corridor, in the 40 minutes he had, moving carefully, keeping track of his time, were the observation rooms. They were behind the wall of what appeared from the main tunnel corridor to be an equipment storage area. A false wall, not dramatically false, not designed to deceive a determined search, but simply presenting a blank institutional face that did not invite inspection. Behind it, a narrow passage, and opening off that passage 3 separate observation stations, each consisting of a small room furnished with a single chair, a narrow desk, and a wide rectangular window of heavy, slightly greenish glass set into the wall. The windows looked into the isolation chambers. Hale stood at the first window for what he described as a long time, though he was acutely conscious of his time limit and he knew it could not truly have been long. The chamber on the other side of the glass was empty. The room was approximately 3 meters by 3 meters, with walls that appeared to have been specifically treated, covered in a material he could not identify from his angle, something with a texture unlike standard institutional paint or plaster. The ceiling was low. The light came from a continuous strip fixture with no visible seam or gap. The floor was bare. On the wall opposite the observation window, scratched into the treated surface with what must have taken considerable sustained effort, was a symbol he did not recognise. Geometric. Specific. He could not have reproduced it from memory, he said later, but he recognised, even in the moment of seeing it, that it had the quality of something intentional. Not the random marking of distress or boredom, but something that had been placed there with care. Placed there to be found, possibly, or placed there because the person who made it could not prevent themselves from making it. He left before his time was up. He walked back through the tunnel to the main maintenance corridor, replaced the key exactly as he'd found it, and went about the rest of his shift with the careful composure of a man who has seen something he will spend the rest of his life trying to understand. He did not go back. He did not need to. Act 12. The overlap hypothesis. The research, in the accounts of those who have pieced it together from surviving fragments and subsequent testimony, reached its most significant and most disturbing conclusion sometime in the late 1950s, perhaps 1958, perhaps 59. The precise dating is uncertain, but the nature of the conclusion is consistent across the sources. A government consultant, identified in the available documentation only as Dr. K, a designation that has generated considerable speculation without firm resolution, produced a theoretical framework that attempted to account for the convergence phenomenon, the shared visions, the identical symbols, the impossible knowledge demonstrated by patient 47. The framework was presented to the core research team in what the surviving memo fragment describes as a classified briefing of considerable duration. The framework has come to be referred to, in the discussions that have grown up around the Danvers accounts, as the overlap hypothesis. Its central claim was this: human consciousness, in its normal waking state, operates within a perceptual field that is actively maintained, not passively received. The brain does not simply take in reality as it is, it actively constructs a version of reality calibrated to the needs of the organism, filtering an enormous quantity of available sensory and informational input down to the workable stream of experience that we recognise as ordinary perception. This filtering process is, in the normal course of events, so robust and so automatic that we have no awareness of it. We experience the output, our ordinary reality, and have no access to, and indeed no knowledge of, the vast quantity of input that is being excluded. What the sensory deprivation and pharmacological protocols appeared to be doing, in Dr. K's framework, was impairing the filtering mechanism, not randomly, not chaotically, in a specific and consistent direction, toward a state in which the brain's ordinary perceptual construction is weakened, and whatever it is that the brain normally filters out becomes partially accessible to consciousness, and whatever that filtered out reality contained, whatever lay in the perceptual territory that ordinary waking consciousness excludes, appeared to be the same for all of the subjects, not personal, not idiosyncratic, shared, consistent, as if it were a feature of external reality rather than a product of individual psychology. The corridor, the figure, the observation rooms, the room beneath. The patients were not imagining the same thing. According to the overlap hypothesis, they were seeing the same place. Act 13. The divergence. The research team did not respond to the overlap hypothesis as a single body. This is one of the most humanly recognisable details in the entire Danvers account. The way that a group of people confronted with an impossible conclusion splits along the lines of what each of them can bear to believe. Some of them had spent their careers in the rational materialist framework of mid-century American science. They had entered the Ward C project with a specific and comprehensible set of assumptions about what they were studying. The limits of human psychological endurance, the mechanics of behavioural manipulation, the controllable parameters of perception and memory. The convergence phenomenon could, for those researchers, be accommodated within an expanded version of that framework. Mass suggestibility, chemical synergy producing consistent neurological effects. Something unexpected, certainly, but something that remained within the domain of the explicable. Others on the team could not maintain that position. The specificity of the shared content, the architectural details of the corridor that matched across patients who had never communicated, the symbols that were identical to a degree of precision that ruled out chance, pushed them toward a conclusion they found profoundly unsettling. The experiments were not producing hallucinations that happened to overlap. The experiments were removing whatever cognitive mechanism normally prevented access to something that was actually there. The division between these two positions hardened over time. The memos from this period, the fragments that have survived, show an increasingly fractured communication style, careful language, hedged claims, the specific avoidances of teams that are no longer operating from a shared premise. Dr. K's overlap hypothesis is referenced obliquely rather than directly. The convergence phenomenon is described in increasingly technical language that seems designed to diffuse its implications rather than engage with them. Patient 47 is referenced in the later memos almost not at all. She had by this point begun describing things that were not in the corridor, not in the observation rooms, not in the lower chamber. She had begun describing what she called the space outside the place, a description that she struggled to render in language and that the research notes transcribe with evident difficulty. She used spatial metaphors and then immediately qualified them. She used temporal language and then said the language was wrong. She said in one of the last recorded interviews with her, "It is not that the room is beneath the tunnels and the hospital and all of this. They are inside of something, and the room is the place where you can almost see what they are inside of." After that interview, the private sessions with patient 47 appear to have stopped. Act 14. The incident. The accounts of what happened in Ward C in the late 1960s are the most fragmentary, the most contested, and the most difficult to assess of all the Danvers material. The temporal distance is greater, the number of direct witnesses is smaller, the documentation is the most severely compromised of any phase of the research period. What follows is the account as it has been reconstructed from the available sources, with the understanding that reconstruction is precisely what it is, not a confirmed record but the most coherent assembly of surviving pieces. Sometime in the late 1960s, most accounts suggest 1968, though some place it earlier in the decade, there was an event in the restricted section of Danvers that resulted in the abrupt termination of the Ward C research program. The event began, in most accounts, with a power failure. Not a localized equipment malfunction, a broader failure that affected multiple sections of the facility simultaneously, including sections that operated on independent backup systems. The failure lasted somewhere between 40 minutes and several hours, depending on the source. During the failure, the observation rooms in the restricted corridor went dark. The isolation chambers lost their controlled acoustic environment. Whatever the patients in those chambers were experiencing in terms of sensory protocol ceased to be managed. What happened next is where the accounts diverge most sharply. Several staff members who were in or near the restricted section during the power failure were subsequently unable to account for a portion of their time during the event. Not the full duration, not the hours that some accounts attribute to the failure, but a specific consistent window of approximately 40 to 50 minutes that each of them reported as simply absent from their memory. They had been in the corridor, then they had been somewhere else, outside, or in a different section of the building, with no recollection of having moved. Patients in the general wards, far from the restricted section, with no apparent connection to the Ward C program, began, in the hours during and following the power failure, exhibiting behaviours that the nursing staff found impossible to explain. Simultaneous agitation across multiple wards. Patients who had been non-verbal for years speaking in what the nurses described as a continuous tone. Not words, not recognisable language, but a vocal output that patients in distant wards appeared to be producing in unison. Patients covering their eyes or pressing their faces against walls. Multiple patients, in multiple separate wards, describing a corridor with a downward grade and a figure standing at its end. And at least 3 staff members, in independent accounts collected in the days following the event, described hearing voices from the sealed lower section of the tunnel network, from the area that had been blocked off and supposedly decommissioned for years. Voices that sounded like multiple people speaking simultaneously in a rhythm that was not quite conversation, coming through the ventilation system, coming from below. The lower ward was sealed the following day. The seals were more extensive than anything previously applied to that area. Institutional concrete poured into the corridor access points, not simply locked doors. The research staff who had been assigned to Ward C were reassigned to other federal programs within weeks. Some simply ceased to appear in any institutional record that has been subsequently located. The files from the program's operational period were removed from the facility. The research, officially, had never happened. Act 15. The Decline. The official history of Danvers State Hospital in its final decades is, in many ways, a straightforward story of institutional failure, the kind of failure that was happening across American psychiatric care in the second half of the 20th century as the philosophy of deinstitutionalization took hold. The development of antipsychotic medications in the 1950s had created the medical case for outpatient treatment of many patients previously confined to long-term institutional care. A series of federal legislative initiatives in the early 1960s, under the Kennedy administration, had shifted funding toward community mental health centres and away from the large state hospitals. The institutions that had housed thousands of patients for decades began, gradually and then rapidly, to empty. Danvers' population peaked somewhere in the 1950s, the same decade, not coincidentally, in which the Ward C program was at its most active, and then began a steady decline. By the late 1970s, the patient population was a fraction of its peak. By the mid-1980s, whole wings of the building were unused, unmaintained, and deteriorating. The staff that remained was stretched across a physical plant designed for a population 10 times the current size. The heating systems failed intermittently. The roofs leaked. The beautiful Kirkbride architecture, the light-filled corridors and arched windows that had once represented a humanitarian vision of psychiatric care, became instead the setting for a slow and unglamorous institutional death. The hospital officially closed in 1992. The building stood empty for more than a decade, a period during which it became, inevitably, a destination for urban explorers, photographers, and those drawn to places where the past has a particular weight. The images from those years are extraordinary. The long ward corridors with their peeling institutional paint and sagging ceilings, the light still falling through the arched windows at certain hours in a way that captured something of the original intent. The medical equipment left behind in rooms that had simply been locked and abandoned when the staff departed. The hydropersons still in the hydrotherapy room, the old records left in filing cabinets, the overwhelming sense of a world stopped mid-motion and never resumed. The lower sections of the facility, the tunnel network, the maintenance areas, were sealed before the building was opened for demolition and redevelopment planning. The seals, in several areas, were described by the demolition crews as more substantial than expected. In at least one section of the tunnel system, they encountered a concrete barrier that appeared to be of much more recent construction than the surrounding infrastructure, mid to late 20th century based on the concrete composition, poured into an access corridor that predated it by decades. Nobody recorded why it had been sealed so thoroughly. Nobody asked. Act 16. The Modern Witnesses. The redevelopment of the Danvers State Hospital site began in the early 2000s. The main Victorian-era building, the central tower, and the immediate adjacent wings, was preserved and converted into a residential complex called Avalon Danvers. The outlying buildings were demolished. The grounds were landscaped into the walking paths and green spaces of a contemporary residential development. The condominiums sold well. The historical significance of the site was acknowledged in architectural plaques and carefully managed historical narratives that emphasised the Kirkbride-era vision and the eventual reform of psychiatric care, without dwelling on the decades of abuse and neglect that had characterised the institution's middle period. The tunnels were sealed before the conversion and have remained sealed. They are not part of the residential infrastructure. They are not accessible to residents. According to the development documentation, they were assessed, deemed structurally compromised in certain sections, and permanently closed off as a safety measure. Before that, in the years when the building stood open and unguarded, explorers had been there. Dozens of them. Probably hundreds over the decade of abandonment, producing a substantial body of photographic and video documentation. Most of it shows exactly what you would expect. Architectural decay, abandoned equipment, the melancholy of institutional spaces stripped of their human purpose. Beautiful in the particular way that ruins are beautiful. Unsettling in the particular way that places of historical suffering are unsettling. But in that body of documentation, there are anomalies. A small number of explorers, fewer than a dozen in the accounts that have been gathered and compared, describe finding sections of the tunnel network that are not fully sealed, sections accessible through obscured or collapsed entry points that the permanent seals did not fully close. And in those sections, in the deeper portions of the underground corridor system, they describe finding rooms that were not on any floor plan of the building they had studied before entering. The rooms contain observation windows. The windows are intact. The surfaces visible through the windows in rooms that should have been sealed for decades show evidence of having been inscribed, marked, repeatedly, with symbols that the explorers photograph and later compare against one another's documentation from separate visits at separate times and find, to their consistent alarm, to be the same. One group, exploring in the mid-2000s, found a reel-to-reel magnetic tape in a sealed aluminum case in a room off one of the lower tunnel corridors. The case was government issue, standard for the period of its manufacture. The tape was partially degraded. What was audible, on the portion of the tape that a subsequent digitization recovered, was a male voice in a clinical register, measured, precise, addressing what appears to be a research summary audience. The recovered portion of the recording is less than 90 seconds. Most of it is too degraded to transcribe. But the final portion, before the tape cuts to silence, is clear. AST 17, the last recording. We have proceeded from the initial assumption that the protocols were generating the convergent content, that the pharmacological and sensory conditions were producing shared hallucination in a manner consistent with prior models of chemically induced psychosis. We no longer hold this position. The evidence accumulated over the course of this program has led us to a conclusion that I recognise will not be welcomed. The protocols are not generating the visions. The protocols are not causing the patients to see the same thing. The protocols are removing whatever it is that normally prevents them from seeing it. We are not producing these experiences. We are exposing what is already there. The treatments are not creating the visions. The treatments are removing whatever normally prevents them. The tape cuts out there. Whatever was said next, whatever conclusions were drawn, whatever recommendations were made, whatever decisions were reached about what to do with the knowledge that the research had produced, is gone, destroyed in the 1973 file destruction, or sealed behind concrete in a sealed section of a sealed tunnel beneath a building that no longer fully exists, or held somewhere in an archive that has not been opened and may never be. We are left with 90 seconds of a man's voice telling us that the experiments did not create something impossible. They revealed something that was already there. Act 18. The epilogue. Let us sit with what the Danvers accounts taken together are actually suggesting. Not the individual claims, not the question of whether Thomas Hale's notebook survives, or whether the research designation Ward C can be verified in a primary document, but the shape of the argument. What the story, at its core, is proposing about the nature of human experience. The standard model of consciousness, the one that has underlain Western scientific and philosophical thinking since Descartes, the one that is embedded in our language and our intuitions, is a model of enclosure. Your consciousness is yours. It is generated by your brain, bounded by your skull, and inaccessible to anyone who is not directly interacting with you through the conventional channels of language and behaviour. What you see when you close your eyes is yours. What you dream is yours. The inside of your mind is the most private space that exists in the universe. More private than your home, more private than a locked room, more private than any physical boundary. The Danvers accounts challenge this assumption, not by proposing telepathy or mysticism or any of the categories that the word paranormal tends to summon. The overlap hypothesis is not a paranormal argument. It is a materialist argument about the filtering function of the brain, about what consciousness is doing when it constructs ordinary experience, and about what lies in the space between that construction and whatever the raw informational reality of the universe actually contains. It says, the inside of your mind is private because something in your brain is actively maintaining that privacy. It is not a natural condition. It is an achievement, and like all achievements, it can be undone. Under extreme conditions, kind of conditions that Danvers was engineering deliberately, and that human beings have sometimes stumbled into accidentally through illness, through trauma, through the extreme edges of meditative practice, through the particular vulnerabilities of sleep, the maintaining mechanism can fail, and when it does, what becomes briefly accessible is not just the idiosyncratic content of your own unconscious. It is something more consistent, something shared, something that does not belong to any individual mind but exists in a space between minds, or outside all minds, or wherever it is that the filtering mechanism has been keeping it. That space has a corridor, a figure at its end, observation rooms behind glass, a lower chamber older than the buildings above it, and in the centre of that chamber, a quality of the air, a density, that patient 47 described as the place where the barrier is thinnest. Thinnest between what and what? That is the question the research was asking when it stopped. That is the question the recording's final audible words circle without answering. That is the question that Danvers, in all its documented horror and all its conspiratorial shadow, holds open like a door that has never quite been pulled shut. The government, in the final accounting of the Danvers conspiracy, did not cover up the Ward C program because the experiments had failed. They did not cover it up because the experiments had produced nothing useful. They covered it up because the experiments had succeeded in a direction no one had prepared for, had succeeded in demonstrating, with the methodological rigour of a Cold War intelligence research program, that the boundary between individual human consciousness and something much larger and much stranger than individual human consciousness is not a wall. It is a membrane, and under the right conditions, or the wrong ones, it becomes possible to see through it. Closing the hill in Danvers is quiet now. The Gothic towers that once watched over the surrounding farmland are gone, replaced by the uncontroversial geometry of a residential development. Families live there, children play in the green spaces, the walking paths curve through grounds that were once asylum fields. It is, by any external measure, an ordinary place, a place that has moved on from what it was, but the tunnels are still there, beneath the renovated floors, still sealed, still cold in the sections that have been measured, beyond what the surrounding earth accounts for. The symbols that were scratched into isolation chamber walls over decades of Ward C protocols have presumably been covered by redevelopment. The observation windows have presumably been filled in or demolished. Presumably. Nobody has confirmed this. Nobody has opened the sealed sections to look. Nobody has excavated the lower levels of the tunnel network to see whether, beneath the maintenance infrastructure of a Victorian-era psychiatric institution, there is a circular chamber of cut stone without mortar, older than the hospital, older than the asylum that preceded it, older than the European settlement of the Massachusetts coast. Nobody has gone to find out whether patient 47's description of the room beneath the tunnels was the account of a traumatized mind constructing comfort from chaos, or whether she was, as she believed, simply describing something that she could see, something that the rest of us are always almost seeing in the quiet moments, in the drift before sleep, in the borderland where the maintaining mechanism goes soft and the edges of ordinary perception become uncertain. That long corridor, the figure at the end of it, the sense of being observed from behind glass, the room beneath everything where the barrier is thinnest. You are drifting now. Let the weight of this settle around you. You are safe wherever you are listening from. Your bed, your chair, the dark of a room that is yours and no one else's. The corridor, if it exists, is very far away. The figure is still, the glass is thick, and whatever lies on the other side of the barrier is not tonight your concern. Tonight you are simply here, and here is enough. Before we begin tonight's journey into one of America's most persistent mysteries, I want to ask a quick favour. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into history's shadows. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It keeps these stories coming. And a huge thank you to Michael for suggesting tonight's topic. This one goes deep. Now let's talk about a secret society that might have changed America forever. Picture this. It's late April in the year 1865. Richmond, Virginia, lies in ruins. Smoke still rises from buildings set ablaze during the evacuation. The Confederate capital has fallen, and Jefferson Davis, president of the dying Confederacy, is fleeing south with whatever remains of his government. In the chaos of that retreat, a train of wagons moves through the darkness, creaking under the weight of heavy cargo. The guards riding alongside are exhausted, but they stay alert. They know what they're protecting. Gold bars wrapped in canvas, silver coins in wooden chests, banknotes and bonds representing fortunes. The final treasury of the Confederate States of America. Everything that remains of a nation that's bleeding to death. History tells us most of that gold was captured, stolen or lost during the desperate retreat. The official records are clear. The case is closed. The Confederate treasury was seized or scattered, and that's the end of it. But what if I told you that eyewitness accounts from that period tell a very different story? What if Union officers testified, under oath, that massive quantities of gold were never recovered? What if there was no clear chain of custody for millions of dollars worth of Confederate assets? What if the math simply doesn't add up, and nobody wants to talk about why? And what if the same name kept appearing in post-war rumours, whispered in backrooms and coded letters? A name that most history textbooks barely mention, if they mention it at all. A name that makes historians uncomfortable when you bring it up at academic conferences. The Knights of the Golden Circle. Tonight, we're going to explore one of America's most enduring conspiracy theories. A secret society that may have planned the Civil War, financed terrorism, and hidden a fortune that could still be buried somewhere in the American South. This isn't fiction. Every event I'm about to describe is documented. The only question is how the pieces fit together. So settle in, turn down the lights, and let me tell you about the secret society the Civil War never buried. Chapter 1. The Birth of an Empire. The year is 1854. Most Americans have never heard of Kansas, Nebraska. The Republican Party is brand new, formed just months earlier by anti-slavery activists who are horrified by the expansion of slavery into Western territories. And in Cincinnati, Ohio, a man named George Washington Lafayette Bickley is about to change history in ways that are still being felt today. Bickley was a curious figure, and that's putting it mildly. Officially he was a physician, though his medical credentials were questionable at best. He claimed to have studied in Britain, but no records support this. He styled himself as a professor and academic, but universities had no record of employing him. What he really was, in modern terms, was a con artist, a propagandist, and what we might today call a political operative with dangerous ideas. But he had charisma. People who met him described a tall, imposing figure with piercing eyes and a voice that could fill a room. He could talk for hours without notes, weaving elaborate visions of Southern glory and manifest destiny. He understood something fundamental about human nature. People don't just want to belong to something. They want to belong to something secret, something special, something that makes them feel chosen. In that year, Bickley founded a secret society. He called it the Knights of the Golden Circle. The name wasn't poetic or symbolic. It was literal, and it was terrifying if you understood what it meant. Bickley envisioned a slave-holding empire that would stretch in a massive circle, 2,400 miles in radius, centered on Havana, Cuba. This golden circle would encompass the entire American South, all of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. It would be, in Bickley's feverish vision, a paradise built on slave labour and southern aristocracy. An empire where wealthy white landowners would rule over millions of enslaved people, extracting unlimited wealth from sugar, cotton, and coffee plantations stretching from Virginia to Venezuela. The plan was detailed, disturbingly detailed. Bickley didn't just have a vision, he had maps, he had economic projections, he had military strategies for conquering Mexico and Central America. He had calculated how many enslaved workers would be needed, how much profit could be generated, how the empire would be governed. It sounds insane. It was insane. But here's the thing that should genuinely disturb you. People listened. Important people, wealthy people, powerful people. The Knights of the Golden Circle wasn't some fringe group meeting in basements and wearing silly hats. It was organised like a military operation from day one. The structure was hierarchical and sophisticated. At the top were the castle leaders, men of wealth and influence who recruited members and organised local chapters. Below them were degrees of initiation, each requiring oaths, rituals, and the learning of secret codes and hand signals. Members didn't just join, they were initiated. The ceremonies involved darkness, candles, dramatic oaths sworn on weapons and symbols. New members were told they were joining something ancient and powerful, though in reality the organisation was barely older than they were. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling of being part of a brotherhood, a conspiracy, a movement that was going to reshape the world. The Knights learned coded language that allowed them to identify each other and communicate in plain sight. They used hand signs borrowed from Masonic traditions. They organised into local chapters called castles, each with its own treasury, meeting place, and roster of members, and they recruited aggressively, targeting men with influence, money, and military experience. By the year 1860, just 6 years after the organisation's founding, conservative estimates suggest the Knights had over 40,000 members across the South and border states. Some historians think the number was much higher, possibly as many as 60 or 70,000. They had infiltrated southern military units, state legislatures, railroad companies and banks. They had money, influence, and most importantly a plan. The KGC wasn't just talking about secession, they were preparing for it. They were stockpiling weapons, they were identifying targets, they were creating networks that could move information, money and people across state lines without detection. They were building an infrastructure for war before the war had even started. And here's what should really make you think. When the Civil War finally came, when the South seceded and the shooting started, Confederate leaders seemed remarkably prepared. Communication networks were already in place, supply lines had been thought through, sympathisers in northern states were already organised and ready to cause problems. How much of that preparedness came from the Knights of the Golden Circle? We'll never know for sure, but the timing is awfully convenient. Chapter 2. The Shadow War. When the Civil War finally erupted in April of 1861 with the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter, something strange happened to the Knights of the Golden Circle. Officially, publicly, the organisation dissolved. Newspapers that had occasionally mentioned the group suddenly stopped. Meeting halls went quiet. The Knights of the Golden Circle seemed to have vanished into history just as the conflict they had helped create was beginning. But Union intelligence reports tell a very different story. And these weren't conspiracy theories or rumours. These were official military intelligence documents, filed by commanders who were genuinely worried about what they were seeing. The Knights didn't disappear. They simply went underground and changed their names, the way a criminal might use an alias when the law gets too close. Some became the Order of American Knights. Others called themselves the Sons of Liberty, deliberately invoking Revolutionary War imagery to make their treason seem patriotic. Same members, same oaths, same goals, just different letterhead. And throughout the war, accusations followed them like a shadow that wouldn't be shaken off. Union authorities documented case after case of sabotage, particularly in the border states of Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. These weren't Confederate states, these were Union territory. But they were full of Southern sympathizers, And more importantly, they were full of nights. Railroad tracks would be destroyed the night before major troop movements. How did the saboteurs know when trains would be passing? Telegraph lines would be cut at exactly the moments when Union commanders needed to communicate most urgently. Coincidence or inside information? Weapons shipments that should have reached Union armies mysteriously disappeared in transit. Where did those weapons go? Were they sold? Hidden? Sent south to Confederate forces? Draft resistance seemed too organised to be spontaneous. When the Union implemented conscription in 1863, riots erupted in multiple northern cities at almost the same time. That takes coordination. That takes planning. That takes an existing network of people willing to act together. Union commanders, particularly in the Western Theatre, became convinced they were fighting two wars simultaneously. One war against the Confederate Army in the South, which was difficult enough, and another war against a secret network operating in their own backyard, behind their own lines, sabotaging their efforts from within. The most dramatic case came in the summer of 1864 in Indianapolis, Indiana. Union authorities had been investigating suspected KGC activity for months. They were building a case, gathering evidence, identifying members, and in August they finally had enough to act. They arrested Harrison H. Dodd, identified as a high-ranking leader in what was now calling itself the Order of the American Knights. Dodd was a lawyer, a respected member of the community. He had money and connections. But Union investigators had evidence, they claimed, that he was planning something much bigger than simple draft resistance. The charges were staggering. Dodd was accused of planning to break Confederate prisoners out of northern prison camps and arm them for attacks on Union cities. The plan allegedly involved coordinating simultaneous uprisings in Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, timed to coincide with Confederate military operations in the South. The goal was nothing less than forcing the Union to fight a two-front war, to divide their forces and potentially tip the balance toward Confederate victory. If even half of these charges were true, it was one of the most ambitious plots of the entire war. Dodd was placed under heavy guard in Indianapolis, awaiting a military tribunal that would almost certainly result in his execution for treason. And then he escaped, just walked out, disappeared, vanished like smoke. The official explanation was embarrassingly vague. Guards were supposedly bribed or distracted. Dodd had help from someone, obviously, but who, and where did he go afterward? Harrison H. Dodd was never found again. He didn't turn up dead. He wasn't captured later in the war. He simply ceased to exist in the historical record. A high-profile prisoner, accused of plotting massive domestic terrorism, just disappeared. How does that happen? How does a man awaiting trial for treason against the United States simply vanish in the middle of the largest war in American history? Who helped him? Where did he go? Did he flee to Confederate territory? Did he hide in plain sight under a new identity? Did he continue his activities from the shadows? The official records don't say. They can't say, because nobody knows. Or if anyone knew, they never told. But investigators at the time began to suspect something that would have been almost too frightening to admit publicly. The Knights of the Golden Circle, or whatever they were calling themselves now, hadn't been planning just for war. They had been planning for defeat. They were thinking long-term. They were preparing for a struggle that wouldn't end with military victory or defeat, but would continue for years, maybe decades afterward. They were preparing for the long game, and that meant they needed to survive as an organisation regardless of who won the war. Chapter 3. The Gold That Vanished. Let's go back to that night in April of 1865. Richmond, Virginia has fallen to Union forces. The Confederate capital, the beating heart of the rebellion, is now behind enemy lines. Robert E. Lee has surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. The war is over, at least for all practical purposes. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, is fleeing south with what remains of his cabinet. They're moving fast, trying desperately to reach Texas or Mexico before Union cavalry catches them. It's a sad end for a government that once controlled 11 states and fielded massive armies. Now it's reduced to a handful of officials and guards. riding through the night, hoping to outrun history. With them travels the Confederate treasury or what's left of it. Wagons loaded with boxes and barrels, guards posted at all times, everything that remains of a nation's wealth, being hauled down muddy roads in the darkness. On May 10th, 1865, Union troops finally catch up with Davis near Irwinville, Georgia. The capture itself is almost anticlimactic. Davis, exhausted and despairing, is taken without a fight. Union officers search the camp and seize the assets they find. Some gold coins, some silver. Personal effects belonging to Davis and his family. They load it all up, document what they've captured, and send Davis north to imprisonment. Case closed. War over. The Confederate treasury has been recovered, except it hasn't. Not really. Because here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean deeply suspicious. The amount of gold and silver seized at Irwinville didn't match Confederate financial records. Not even close. Not within several $1 million of close. Confederate ledgers indicated the government had received substantial foreign loans, particularly from British and French sympathisers who believed in the Southern cause and saw profit in supporting it. They had held massive payroll funds to pay Confederate soldiers and officers. They had controlled private assets from Southern banks and wealthy donors who had literally given their fortunes to the cause. Ships had run the Union blockade carrying gold. Bonds had been sold. Wealth had been concentrated. Where did it all go? Union authorities interrogated Davis and his associates extensively. They weren't gentle about it. They wanted answers. They needed answers. The American people were demanding answers. Where was the Confederate gold? The responses they got were vague, contradictory, or simply non-existent. Some prisoners claimed the money had been spent during the long retreat from Richmond to Georgia. Spent on what? Food? Supplies? With what they had to show for it? Others said it had been stolen by deserting soldiers in the chaos of the Confederate collapse. Possible, but that would mean finding huge amounts of gold on random deserters, and that didn't happen. A few witnesses gave a different explanation, and this one kept coming up in different interviews, from different people who had no reason to coordinate their stories. They said the money had been distributed to various trusted officers with orders to hide it until the South could rise again. Hide it geographically. Spread it out. Make it impossible to find or seize all at once. That last explanation kept coming up. Hide it until the South could rise again. Not spend it. Not secure it. Hide it. As if defeat was not the end of the conflict, but merely an intermission. Witnesses later came forward with stories that gave texture to these vague explanations. A wagon train guarded by men in Confederate uniforms, splitting off from the main column near the Georgia-South Carolina border and heading into the wilderness. Where were they going? Nobody followed to find out. Gold bars being loaded onto mules in the dead of night while the main camp slept. Who ordered it? Who received it? Trusted officers receiving sealed orders from Davis himself and then disappearing into the countryside, never to rejoin the retreating government. And when investigators tried to track down these officers, tried to follow these leads, they hit walls. The men involved? Many were later identified as former Knights of the Golden Circle members, not suspected members, documented members whose names appeared on captured KGC membership rolls from earlier in the war. Southern bankers with secret affiliations who had managed the Confederacy's finances. Confederate intelligence officers who had spent the war running covert operations. These weren't random choices. These were men selected for a reason. Men who could keep secrets. Men who belonged to organisations that valued loyalty unto death. By 1866, barely a year after the war's end, rumours were spreading across the South like a fever. The gold was out there somewhere, buried in caches scattered across multiple states, hidden in caves known only to a few, divided among trusted guardians who had sworn oaths to protect it with their lives, and all of it allegedly marked with symbols, protected by coded maps, and defended by men who would kill to keep the secret. The treasure hunt had begun, and it would claim lives for decades to come. Chapter 4. Symbols in the Woods. Over the next several decades, something strange started happening across the American South. People began finding things in the woods, in their fields, carved into rocks on their property. Strange symbols, deliberate markings, messages from the past written in a language most people couldn't read. The symbols were consistent enough that researchers eventually compiled catalogues trying to decode them. Hearts with arrows pointing in specific directions, turtles with marks on their shells indicating numbers or distances, owls with one eye open, turkey tracks arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural, snakes forming circles or figure eights, all arranged in ways that suggested purpose, meaning, direction. These weren't random scratches made by bored travellers. These were carved with tools, positioned in relation to landmarks, often protected from weather by overhangs or deliberate placement. Someone had spent time on them. Someone had meant them to last. Someone had intended them to be found by people who would know what they meant. Were these markers pointing to buried Confederate gold? Or were they elaborate hoaxes created by con artists preying on Southern desperation and nostalgia? The problem with dismissing them as hoaxes is simple and disturbing. People who found these markers often died. Not eventually, not of old age, suspiciously, quickly, under circumstances that didn't quite add up. I'm not exaggerating for effect. There's a pattern in the historical record that's genuinely disturbing when you see it laid out. A farmer in rural Georgia finds a carved stone on his property while ploughing. It's got symbols he doesn't recognise, but they're clearly man-made and look old. He mentions it at church the following Sunday, excited about the possibility of finding treasure. 2 weeks later, he's found dead in the woods, supposedly from a hunting accident. Except he wasn't carrying a rifle. His rifle was found at home, so who shot him? A prospector in Arkansas discovers a map hidden in the lining of an old Confederate uniform he bought from a widow. The map shows landmarks he recognises, symbols he doesn't. He starts asking around town about the symbols, showing the map to people he trusts. His cabin burns down 3 weeks later with him inside. The fire inspector rules it an accident, despite finding evidence the door had been nailed shut from the outside. A family in Missouri begins digging in a suspicious location on their land after the grandfather claims he remembers Confederate soldiers burying something there during the war. They find a stone marker with KGC symbols. They dig deeper. Armed men arrive at their property one night, masked and carrying weapons. They order the family to stop digging, to forget what they've seen, and to never speak of it again. The family stops digging. They don't report it to the sheriff. When asked about it years later, they claim they don't remember what the armed men looked like or how many there were. They're terrified, decades after the fact. The newspapers of the late 1800s are full of these stories, particularly in Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky and Georgia. Local papers would run articles about mysterious deaths, strange intimidation, and treasure hunting gone wrong. And here's the unsettling part. In most cases, local sheriffs didn't investigate thoroughly. Or if they did, the cases were quietly dropped without explanation. Why? What pressure was being applied? Who had enough influence in multiple states to make law enforcement back off repeatedly? The implication is obvious but terrifying. Someone was guarding something, and they had enough power, enough reach, enough organisational capability to intimidate local law enforcement in multiple states across multiple decades. That's not a random group of treasure hoarders. That's an organisation, a network, a conspiracy that functioned across state lines and across generations. In the 1890s, newspapers in Texas and Arkansas ran multiple stories about mysterious armed men forcing landowners to abandon property. These weren't robberies. The armed men didn't steal anything. They didn't want the land, they just wanted the residents gone, immediately and permanently. No explanations, no negotiations. Just leave and don't come back. Some families complied. They packed up and left, abandoning property they'd owned for decades. Others tried to stand their ground and found themselves facing escalating harassment. Livestock killed, barns burned, warning shots fired at night. Eventually everyone left. Who were these men? What were they protecting? Were they remnants of the Knights of the Golden Circle, still operating decades after the Civil War? Were they descendants of the original knights, carrying on some kind of guardian tradition passed down through families? Were they hired muscle being paid by someone with resources and a vested interest in keeping certain areas undisturbed? Or were they something else entirely? Something that had evolved from the knights but wasn't quite the same? Organisation anymore? Chapter 5. From Knights to Clan. We need to talk about timing. And when I say we need to talk about it, I mean this is one of those historical coincidences that's almost too convenient to be a coincidence. December of 1865, Pulaski, Tennessee, just 8 months after the war's end. 6 Confederate veterans are sitting around, bored and restless. The war is over. They lost. The world they knew is gone. The social order they fought to preserve is being dismantled by Reconstruction. They're young men with military training and no purpose, so they form a social club. At least that's what they claim it is. They're bored, they say. They want something to do. They create elaborate costumes, mysterious rituals, grandiose titles that sound impressive but mean nothing. They ride through town at night in sheets and hoods, pretending to be ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers. It's all just pranks and theatre, they insist. They call themselves the Ku Klux Klan. The name comes from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle. Interesting choice of words, isn't it? Circle. At first, it really did seem to be just a social club. Costumes and midnight rides. Pranks designed to startle freedmen and carpetbaggers. It was juvenile, offensive, but not yet organised violence. But within 2 years, something changed. The play acting stopped being play. The social club transformed into something much darker, much more dangerous. A terrorist organisation dedicated to violently resisting Reconstruction and maintaining white supremacy through intimidation, assault, and murder. The transformation was remarkably quick and remarkably organised. Local chapters appeared across the South almost simultaneously. They had uniform rituals, similar costumes, and coordinated tactics. They operated with military precision. When they decided to target someone, the attacks would happen on the same night in multiple counties, making it impossible for limited law enforcement to respond effectively. This wasn't organic growth. This was activation of an existing network. The early Klan had a structure that looked awfully, disturbingly familiar to anyone who had studied Confederate secret societies. Secret oaths sworn in darkness, coded language that allowed members to identify each other, local chapters operating independently but following central guidance, a hierarchical command system with elaborate titles, blood initiation ceremonies, penalties for breaking oaths that were clearly stated and genuinely frightening. Sound like anyone we've been talking about? Here's where conspiracy theorists get very interested, and honestly, their interest isn't entirely unjustified. Several early Klan leaders had documented ties to Confederate intelligence networks during the war. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Klan's first Grand Wizard, had commanded cavalry units that included known KGC members. He had experience with covert operations, raids behind enemy, lines, and the kind of decentralized command structure that secret organizations require. Other early Klan leaders had backgrounds in secret fraternal organizations. They knew how to create rituals that bound men together. They understood the psychology of secret societies, how shared secrets create loyalty stronger than law or conscience. And the Klan's rapid spread across the South followed patterns that looked less like spontaneous organisation and more like activation of an existing network. It was as if someone had a list of trusted men in each county, men who could be relied upon to organise and lead, men who already knew how to operate in secret, men who had done this before. Could the Knights of the Golden Circle have simply rebranded again? Could the KGC's ideology, infrastructure, membership roles, and yes, hidden wealth have been absorbed into the Klan? There's no smoking gun, no document that says, "Dear Klan, love the Knights of the Golden Circle. Here's our member list, our operational procedures, and some gold to fund your activities." Historical conspiracies rarely leave convenient paper trails, but the circumstantial evidence is deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Both organisations had essentially identical goals: preserve Southern power structures, resist federal authority by any means necessary, and maintain racial hierarchies through violence if needed. Both used secret rituals and violent intimidation as their primary tools. Both operated through decentralized cells that were difficult for authorities to infiltrate or destroy. Both had support from local elites who provided protection and resources, and both had financial resources that seemed to exceed what you'd expect from their claimed origins. Where did the early clan get its funding? Sheets and robes cost money, horses cost money, arms cost money. Coordinating across multiple states costs money. Someone was paying for all of this, and it wasn't membership dues from poor farmers. How did it spread so quickly across such a large geographic area? Who was coordinating the violence? Who was training local leaders? Who was providing the operational manuals that made different clan chapters operate so similarly? The official histories don't have good answers to these questions. Maybe because the truth was too disturbing to admit. Maybe because acknowledging a direct link between the KGC and the clan would have meant admitting that Reconstruction was facing an organised insurgency with deep roots and significant resources, not just random violence from sore losers. That would have been a terrifying admission for the federal government to make. It would have meant the Civil War hadn't really ended. It had just changed tactics. Chapter 6. The Lincoln Question. We have to address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the assassination at the theatre. April 14th, 1865. Ford's Theatre in Washington, District of Columbia. The play is Our American Cousin, a comedy that's popular with wartime audiences looking for distraction. President Abraham Lincoln is in the presidential box with his wife Mary, Major Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée Clara Harris. They're relaxed. The war is essentially over. Lincoln can finally breathe. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, John Wilkes Booth enters the presidential box. He's an actor. He's been in this theatre many times. The staff knows him. Nobody stops him. He knows the play well enough to time his approach for a moment when the audience will be laughing, covering the sound of his entry. Booth shoots President Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head at point-blank range. Lincoln slumps forward, mortally wounded. He'll die the next morning, never regaining consciousness. Booth leaps from the box to the stage, breaking his leg in the landing, and shouts something the witnesses can't quite agree on. Then he limps out of the theatre and disappears into the Washington night. For 12 days, John Wilkes Booth evades capture. Let that sink in. The most wanted man in America, having just committed the most significant assassination in the nation's history, manages to avoid capture for nearly 2 weeks. How? He moves through a network of safe houses. He crosses the Potomac River into Virginia. He finds people willing to hide him, feed him, treat his injuries. He has contacts, resources, and most importantly, a plan that extends beyond the assassination itself. This wasn't a spontaneous act by a lone madman. This was planned. This was coordinated. This had infrastructure behind it. Eventually, Union cavalry tracks Booth down to a tobacco barn near Bowling Green, Virginia. They surround the barn. They demand his surrender. Booth refuses. The barn is set on fire to force him out. In the chaos and smoke, a shot rings out. Booth falls, mortally wounded. He dies a few hours later. The official story is that Sergeant Boston Corbett, acting against orders, shot Booth to prevent his escape. Corbett claimed divine instruction to fire. He was never punished. Some witnesses said it looked like Booth shot himself. The truth died with everyone in that barn. The official investigation concluded that Booth was part of a conspiracy, but a relatively small one. A handful of co-conspirators, all Confederate sympathizers, acting largely on their own initiative to strike a blow against the Union government. 8 people were arrested, tried, and convicted. 4 were hanged. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed. Not really. It never has been. Researchers have spent over a century and a half picking apart Booth's movements, his contacts and his resources, and some of what they've found is genuinely troubling, raising questions that official history has never satisfactorily answered. Booth had connections to known Confederate intelligence operatives, not suspected connections, documented ones. He had travelled to Canada in the months before the Yale assassination, where Confederate agents were known to be operating. He had money. More money than an actor should have had. Where did it come from? His escape route followed pathways that matched documented Underground Railroad routes used by Southern agents during the war. Not approximately, exactly. The same houses, the same contacts, the same methods. Someone had planned this route before, tested it, confirmed it would work. The safe houses that sheltered Booth weren't random Confederate sympathisers. They had ties to secret societies and organised Southern resistance networks. Some had connections, documented in later research, to men who had been Knights of the Golden Circle members before the war. And here's the really interesting part that conspiracy researchers focus on. The assistance network Booth used looked remarkably similar to the escape tactics attributed to the Knights of the Golden Circle during the war. The organisation, the security protocols, the way information was compartmentalised so that each link in the chain only knew the next step, not the whole plan. This is sophisticated tradecraft. This is how intelligence organisations operate. This isn't how a random group of angry Southerners would organise an assassination plot. Did the Knights help plan Lincoln's assassination? Did they provide Booth with resources, training and support? Were they part of a larger plot to decapitate the Union government and create chaos that might somehow revive Confederate hopes? The conspiracy theorists point to several disturbing coincidences. The assassination happened just days after Lee's surrender, when Confederate cause was clearly lost. Why then? If it was about changing the war's outcome, it was too late. But if it was about revenge, or about creating a martyred president whose death would poison Reconstruction and benefit Southern resistance, then the timing makes perfect sense. Official investigations never proved KGC involvement. They never even seriously investigated it. But they also never fully ruled it out. The evidence was circumstantial, fragmentary, and often destroyed or lost. What we're left with is a question mark, a big one. And the more you look at the details, the more you notice the gaps in the official story, the bigger that question mark becomes. Chapter 7. The 20th Century Ghosts. You might think that by the 1900s the Knights of the Golden Circle would be ancient history. A relic of the Civil War era, as dead as the Confederacy itself. Something that belonged in dusty archives and academic dissertations, not in the living world. But strange things kept happening. Little things, easily dismissed individually but disturbing when you see them as a pattern. Throughout the early 20th century, occasional reports surfaced that didn't quite make sense. Men in small southern towns identifying themselves as knights to people they thought they could trust. Why would anyone claim membership in a defunct organisation unless it wasn't actually defunct? Old Confederate symbols appearing in unexpected places, carved into the foundations of new buildings, or incorporated into business logos in ways that seemed deliberately coded. Bank records tied to defunct Southern trusts that seemed to have more money than they should, funds that appeared to grow over time rather than depleting. In 1934, something happened in Oklahoma that encapsulates the entire mystery. A man named William, a carpenter and amateur historian, was renovating an old house that had supposedly been built by a Confederate veteran. He was tearing out a wall when he found something hidden in the cavity between the studs. A map, hand-drawn on aged paper, sealed in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The map showed local landmarks, some of which still existed, others that William had to research to identify, and it was covered in symbols, hearts, turtles, owls, the same symbols that had been appearing on treasure maps and stone markers for 70 years. William was excited. He was careful. He didn't immediately announce his find to the world. He showed it to a few trusted friends. He started researching the symbols, trying to decode them. He planned an expedition to some of the marked locations. He was methodical, thoughtful, doing everything right. 3 weeks later, William was found dead in his home. The official cause of death was listed as heart attack. He was 32 years old, in good health, with no family history of heart problems. He'd been working in his garage when it happened, apparently. Alone. No witnesses. The map disappeared. When William's widow looked for it among his possessions, it was gone. She knew he'd been keeping it in a locked drawer in his workshop. The drawer was still locked, The map wasn't there, she never reported it missing. When researchers tried to interview her years later about her husband's death, she refused to discuss it. She was afraid, decades after the fact. You could see it in her eyes, people said. She was still afraid. This pattern repeated itself again and again throughout the century. Someone finds something, maybe an old map, maybe a journal, maybe carved symbols on their property. They get excited, they tell people, they start investigating. Then suddenly they don't want to talk anymore. Or they can't. In 1957, a man in Arkansas claimed he'd found a carved stone with KGC symbols while clearing land. He brought it to the local historical society, excited to share his discovery. The society photographed it, documented it, and asked if they could keep it for further study. He agreed. 2 weeks later, he returned and demanded the stone back, visibly shaken. The society returned it. He destroyed it with a sledgehammer in the parking lot, then left and never spoke of it again. Historical society members later said he looked terrified, like someone had put a genuine fear into him. In 1973, a construction crew in East Texas accidentally uncovered what appeared to be a small buried vault while excavating for a shopping centre foundation. Inside were Confederate coins, personal effects, and documents. The vault had KGC symbols carved into its stone lid. The crew foreman called the site supervisor. The supervisor made some phone calls. Within hours, men in suits arrived and took control of the site. The crew was told to forget what they'd seen, and were given substantial bonuses to ensure their silence. The vault and its contents disappeared. The shopping centre was built. To this day, nobody knows what happened to the artefacts or who those men in suits were. The treasure hunters who survived these encounters learned an important lesson. If you find something real, you stay quiet. You don't post about it on social media, though that didn't exist for most of this history. You don't give interviews. You don't write books. You very carefully navigate the legal questions about claiming buried treasure on public or private land, and you hope nobody asks too many questions. And if you're smart, you ask yourself why this particular cache has gone undiscovered for over 100 years, why no one else has found it, and whether maybe, just maybe, it was left unfound for a reason. Whether someone is still keeping track, still watching, still guarding secrets their great-great-grandfathers swore to protect. The treasure hunters who've been at this for decades, the ones who are still alive and still willing to talk, they all tell similar stories. They'll be researching a promising site. They'll start finding markers. The symbols match documented KGC codes. The location makes historical sense. They'll plan an expedition. And then someone shows up. Could be a friendly local who warns them the property owner is litigious. Could be someone claiming to represent historical preservation interests. Could be people who don't bother with explanations, who just make it very clear through body language and implication that moving along would be the smart choice. It happens too often to be coincidence, too consistently across too many years in too many locations to be random chance. Chapter 8. The Gaps That Remain Here's the fundamental problem with the Knights of the Golden Circle story, and it's a problem that should bother anyone who values historical truth. We know they existed. That's not in dispute. We have membership rolls recovered from raids during the Civil War. We have meeting minutes captured by Union forces. We have contemporary newspaper accounts describing their activities. We have court documents from wartime trials of suspected members. The Knights of the Golden Circle were real. We know they were large, well-organised, and had significant influence in southern and border states. That's also thoroughly documented. Estimates of 40 to 60,000 members aren't wild speculation. They're based on captured documents, testimony from defectors, and Union intelligence reports compiled by people with no reason to exaggerate. We know they had money. Membership dues, sure, but also backing from wealthy southern planters and businessmen who saw the organisation as serving their interests. They had the resources to publish newspapers, fund expeditions, and maintain a network of meeting halls across multiple states. What we don't know is what happened to them after the war, and that gap in the historical record isn't just suspicious, it's gaping. It's the kind of hole that swallows entire conspiracy theories, and still has room for more. Most KGC documents were destroyed. Whether deliberately or through the chaos of war, the organisation's records largely vanished. We're not talking about a few missing ledgers. We're talking about entire archives that should exist but don't. Membership rolls that should list thousands of names just gone. Financial records that should show where money came from and where it went disappeared. Correspondence that should reveal the organisation's plans and operations destroyed or lost. Confederate files were burned as Richmond fell. That's documented. The Confederate government ordered the destruction of sensitive documents to prevent them from falling into Union hands. But which documents were considered most sensitive? Which were prioritised for destruction? Were KGC files among them? We don't know, because the records of what was destroyed were also destroyed. Post-war America had powerful reasons to bury the past and move forward. The country was exhausted, hundreds of thousands dead, the economy shattered, the social order completely upended. There was a genuine, understandable desire to just stop fighting and start rebuilding. Admitting that a large, well-funded secret society had survived the war and might still be operating would have been devastating to that effort. It would undermine everything Reconstruction was trying to accomplish. It would expose federal failures to control domestic threats. It would raise uncomfortable questions about missing Confederate assets and who might have access to them. It would suggest that the war hadn't really ended, just changed forms. So the official story became simple, clean, reassuring. The Knights of the Golden Circle were a pre-war conspiracy that faded away when their dreams of a southern empire died at Appomattox. They disbanded, their members went home. Some joined other organisations like the Klan, but the KGC itself ceased to exist. End of story. Clean, simple, reassuring. Probably not true. Because here's what doesn't make sense about that narrative. Organisations don't usually announce when they disband, especially secret organisations. They don't take out newspaper ads saying the Knights of the Golden Circle are officially dissolved, thank you for your support. They just go quiet. And going quiet doesn't mean ceasing to exist. It just means becoming invisible. And there's another problem with the official narrative. The Knights had been planning for Confederate defeat since at least 1863, possibly earlier. There's evidence of this in captured correspondence. They were thinking long-term. They were preparing for a protracted struggle. They were hiding resources and building networks designed to survive military defeat. Why would an organisation that had spent years preparing for defeat suddenly give up the moment defeat actually came? That's not how groups work, especially groups built on ideology and bound by blood oaths. The more logical explanation is that they did exactly what they'd been planning to do. They went underground, they protected their resources, they waited, and maybe, just maybe, they're still waiting. Chapter 9. The question that won't die. Let's lay out what we know for certain. The Knights of the Golden Circle existed as a large organised secret society before and during the Civil War. Fact. Large amounts of Confederate gold and assets disappeared at the end of the war with no clear accounting. Fact. Treasure markers and coded symbols appeared across the South in the decades following the war. Fact. People who investigated these markers often met with mysterious deaths or intimidation. Fact. The early Ku Klux Klan emerged with a structure and spread pattern that resembled earlier Confederate secret societies. Fact. What we don't know is how these facts connect, and that's where it gets interesting. If the Knights of the Golden Circle really did plan for Confederate defeat, if they really did hide massive wealth, if they really did embed themselves into post-war American society, then we have to ask some uncomfortable questions. How long did they survive? What did they become? Did they evolve into something else? Or did they eventually fade away? If the gold still exists, who's guarding it now? And here's the most disturbing possibility. What if they never went away at all? What if the Knights of the Golden Circle simply learned to operate in the shadows, influencing events without drawing attention, maintaining their network across generations? Secret societies don't usually announce when they disband. They just stop being visible. That doesn't mean they stop existing. Chapter 10. The evidence in the ground. There's a reason treasure hunters are still looking for KGC gold, and it's not just fantasy or delusion or the appeal of a romantic mystery. Real discoveries have been made. Documented discoveries. The kind that make it into newspapers and legal proceedings because people have to figure out who owns what and how much tax is owed. In the 1980s, a man in Arkansas whose name was never publicly released found a cache of gold coins buried on property he'd recently purchased. The coins were genuine Civil War-era gold, worth a small fortune even at face value, worth much more to collectors, and they were buried in a very specific pattern, arranged in a way that matched documented KGC symbols. This wasn't random. This wasn't some Confederate soldier burying his pay. This was organised, intentional, and coded. The man did everything right legally. He reported the find to authorities. He paid taxes on the value. He worked with archaeologists to document the site properly. And then he never said another word about where exactly he found it, or what else might be out there. When reporters tried to follow up, he refused all interviews. When treasure hunters tried to trace the location based on public records, they hit dead ends. The man knew what he'd found, reported enough to stay legal, and then sealed his mouth shut. Why? What did he know? What did he suspect? Did someone approach him? Did he figure out on his own that staying quiet was the smart choice? In the 1990s, a construction crew in Texas, working on a highway expansion project, accidentally uncovered a stone vault. This wasn't a treasure hunter's fantasy. This was heavy equipment operated by workers who didn't care about Civil War history. They just wanted to finish the job and go home. The vault was about 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, sealed with mortar that had held for over a century. Inside, they found Confederate currency, personal effects including letters and a diary, and various items that indicated this had been buried by someone with means and connections. The vault had KGC symbols carved into its stone lid, not painted, not scratched, carved deep, meant to last, meant to identify to those who knew the code. The contents were turned over to local historians and eventually ended up in a museum collection. But here's the interesting part. The exact location of the find was never publicly disclosed. The construction records show a general area, but not specific coordinates. When asked why, state officials cited concerns about treasure hunters and site preservation. But the site was under a highway. There was no site left to preserve. What were they really protecting? These aren't urban legends. These are documented finds with paperwork, witnesses, and physical artifacts, which means the rumours weren't all fantasy. Something really was buried out there. The question is, how much and who knows where? In 2007, a metal detecting hobbyist in Kentucky found a sealed mason jar containing gold coins and a document on private property with the owner's permission. The document was a letter, dated 1866, with what appeared to be coded instructions. The letter referenced the circle and mentioned that what is buried shall remain until the time is right. The gold coins alone were worth over $30,000. The letter has never been fully decoded, though several cryptographers have tried. The finder split the proceeds with the property owner as agreed. They both signed non-disclosure agreements at the advice of their lawyers, which seems like an odd thing to do over a jar of old coins unless someone was worried about something more than taxes. And here's something that should make you think. In almost every documented case of KGC-related treasure being found, the finders either stay quiet afterward or face mysterious pressure to stop looking, stop talking, stop investigating. It's not every time. Some people find old coins and that's the end of it. But when the find includes KGC symbols, when it appears to be part of a larger pattern, when it suggests there's more out there, that's when things get strange. That's when people start getting careful about what they say. Chapter 11. The Map That Can't Be Read. Here's something that genuinely haunts researchers who study the KGC. Something that keeps them up at night turning over possibilities in their minds. Authentic treasure maps allegedly created by the Knights do exist in various museums and private collections across the South. They've been authenticated as period documents by multiple experts. The paper is right, matching paper stock from the 1860s. The ink is right, consistent with iron gall ink used during the Civil War era. The handwriting matches known Confederate styles and shows the characteristic flourishes of educated men from that period. These aren't obvious forgeries created by modern hoaxers. These are genuine 19th century documents, but they can't be read. And that's the problem that's driven cryptographers and treasure hunters to distraction for over a century. The maps use a cipher system that has never been fully cracked. Symbols that might represent landmarks, distances or directions, but without a key, without the code book or verbal instructions that would have been passed between members, they're just intricate drawings. Beautiful, precise, maddeningly useless drawings. Some researchers have spent entire careers trying to decode these maps. They've applied every known cipher technique from the 1800s. They've tried substitution ciphers, where each symbol represents a letter or number. They've tried transposition ciphers, where the symbols need to be rearranged according to a pattern. They've tried book ciphers, where the symbols might reference specific words in well-known texts like the Bible or Shakespeare. Nothing works completely. They can make educated guesses. They can extrapolate based on geographical knowledge and historical context. They can sometimes identify what might be a church or a river or a crossroads, but they can't definitively read the maps from start to finish. They can't follow the instructions the way the original knights would have. And here's what makes it even more frustrating. The cipher system appears to be multi-layered. Some symbols seem to be straightforward landmarks. A church might be indicated by a cross, a river by wavy lines. But then other symbols are clearly coded, and the code itself might vary from map to map, suggesting that different castles or different members use different variants of the base system. It's brilliant security when you think about it. Even if someone captured a map, even if they understood that it led to buried treasure, they couldn't follow it without additional knowledge. Knowledge that would have been passed down verbally from member to member, perhaps through the initiation rituals or through private instruction from castle leaders to their most trusted subordinates. It's the perfect security system for its time. A treasure map that requires human knowledge to interpret. Knowledge that might have died with its keepers as the organisation aged, and members passed away without proper successors. Or knowledge that might still be held by someone somewhere who knows exactly what they're protecting and why. And here's the really interesting thing that comes up when you talk to modern cryptographers who've worked on these maps. They say the cipher system shows signs of being deliberately designed to be unbreakable without the key. It's not just complex. It's structured in a way that prevents pattern analysis from working. The symbols don't repeat in predictable ways. There aren't enough examples to do frequency analysis. It's as if whoever designed the system understood the principles of cryptography well enough to build in defences against the standard code-breaking techniques. Where did a group of southern conspirators in the 1850s and 60s get that kind of expertise? Some members had military training, sure, but this is more sophisticated than military field codes of that era. Some researchers speculate that KGC leaders studied European secret society traditions, borrowing techniques from groups like the Freemasons or even older organisations. Or maybe they just had someone in the organisation who was genuinely brilliant at creating codes. Someone whose identity we'll never know because the records burned with Richmond. Chapter 12. The Modern Search. Today, there's a subculture of treasure hunters, historians, and conspiracy enthusiasts who are still looking for KGC gold. They compare notes online, they share theories, they make expeditions into remote areas of the South with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. Most find nothing. Some find bottles and old nails. A few find things they won't talk about publicly. Because here's what they've learned. If you find something real, you stay quiet. You don't post about it on social media. You don't give interviews. You very carefully navigate the legal questions about claiming buried treasure on public or private land. And if you're smart, you ask yourself why no one else has found this in over 150 years, and whether maybe it was left unfound for a reason. The treasure hunters who've been at this for decades tell the same story. They'll be researching a promising site. They'll start finding markers. The symbols match. The location makes sense. They'll plan an expedition, and then someone shows up. Could be a local property owner, could be someone claiming historical preservation concerns, could be people who just make it clear they should move along. It happens too often to be coincidence. Final chapter. What if it's true? Let's do a thought experiment. Let's say everything the conspiracy theorists claim is true. The Knights of the Golden Circle survived the Civil War. They hid massive amounts of Confederate wealth. They evolved, adapted, and maintained their organisation across generations. What would that mean? It would mean there's a secret society, over 150 years old, sitting on a fortune in gold and historical artefacts. It would mean they've successfully stayed hidden while the world changed completely around them. It would mean they've passed down knowledge, rituals and responsibilities through multiple generations. It would mean they're still out there. Now, let's be clear. I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm saying it's what some people believe happened. And the reason they believe it is because the alternative explanations have gaps you could drive a truck through. Where did the Confederate gold go? It was lost doesn't really answer the question when witnesses say it was deliberately hidden. Why do treasure markers appear across the South? It's a hoax doesn't explain why people keep dying when they find them. How did the early Klan spread so quickly with such sophisticated organisation? Confederate veterans is a vague answer that doesn't account for the resources involved. The official history has gaps. The conspiracy theory fills those gaps. Maybe not correctly, but it fills them with a narrative that's at least coherent. Epilogue. The truth we'll never know. Here's what I believe after researching this topic for hours and hours, after reading everything I could find, after talking to treasure hunters and historians and people who've spent their lives chasing these shadows. The Knights of the Golden Circle were absolutely real. They were large, influential and genuinely dangerous. They absolutely played a significant role in pushing the South toward a secession and supporting the Confederate cause during the Civil War. That's not speculation. That's documented historical fact. I also believe that Confederate gold was deliberately hidden at the end of the war. Not all of it. Probably not even most of it. A lot of Confederate wealth really was lost to chaos, stolen by deserters, or seized by Union forces. But significant amounts, meaningful amounts, were deliberately cached by people who hoped and believed the South would rise again and need those resources. This also isn't wild speculation. We have witness testimony, we have documented discoveries, we have too many consistent accounts across too many years to dismiss it all as fantasy. Were those people members of the KGC? Probably some of them were. The KGC was the most organised, most sophisticated secret society in the Confederacy. They had the structure, the discipline and the ideology to carry out long-term plans. It makes perfect logical sense they'd be involved in any plan to hide assets and prepare for a protracted resistance. Did they survive as an organisation after the war? That's where it gets murky, where the facts blur into speculation and possibility. I think elements of the KGC probably did persist for a while, maybe even for decades. The infrastructure was there, the ideology was there, the motivation was certainly there. Organisations don't just evaporate when they lose a war, especially organisations built on blood oaths and shared secrets. But did they maintain the same structure and goals as the war years? Did they evolve into something else, something adapted to the changed reality of post-war America? Did they eventually just fade away as members died, and their secrets died with them, as the world changed too much for their antebellum dreams to make any sense? I don't know. Nobody knows. That's the frustrating and fascinating thing about this story. What I do know is that treasure hunters are still finding things, not in huge numbers, but consistently enough that it can't all be dismissed. Symbols are still carved in stone across the South, weathered but visible if you know where to look. And people who know the history, who've studied it deeply, still get uncomfortable when you start asking questions about certain locations. There's still something there, whether it's actual buried gold or just the cultural memory of secrets that were real once. I can't say for certain. Something happened in the 1860s. The evidence is there in archives and museums. The gaps in the historical record are there in what's missing from those same archives. The unanswered questions are there in every documentary find that raises 10 new questions. Maybe the truth is mundane. A bunch of Confederate sympathisers buried some gold with the best of intentions. They drew maps and carved markers, but time passed. They died. Their children didn't care about the old cause. The markers eroded. Development covered burial sites. The treasure either doesn't exist in meaningful quantities anymore, or is lost forever, buried under highways and shopping centres and suburban sprawl. That's one possibility. It's a reasonable possibility. It might even be the truth. Or maybe the truth is stranger. Maybe there really is a network of guardians, not an organised secret society like the original Knights, but a tradition passed down through certain families. Knowledge that great-great-grandfather was trusted with something important. A sense of duty to protect what was hidden, even if the original cause is long dead and the gold itself matters less than the principle of keeping faith with the past. I can't tell you which it is. I can only tell you that the Knights of the Golden Circle definitely existed. They had the means, motive, an opportunity to hide Confederate wealth. They planned for defeat and prepared for a long struggle, and over a century and a half later, people are still looking for what they left behind, still finding markers and symbols, still encountering mysteries that resist easy explanation. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the mystery itself is the legacy. Not gold or secret societies or conspiracy theories, but the reminder that history has gaps, that the official story is often incomplete, that there are always secrets just beneath the surface of what we think we know. Closing thoughts. Were the Knights of the Golden Circle just a failed Confederate relic? A historical footnote about Southern extremists who dreamed too big and lost? Or were they America's first true underground power network? An organisation that planned for the long game, that hid resources and embedded themselves so deeply in post-war society that they became invisible? And if the gold still exists, sitting in caves or buried under farmland or hidden in places no one has looked for 150 years, who's guarding it now? Is it still being guarded at all? Or has time finally won, and the secrets of the Knights of the Golden Circle died with the last generation that knew them? I don't have answers, just questions. And the more you dig into this story, the more questions you'll have too. So maybe that's the real legacy of the Knights of the Golden Circle, not gold or secret societies or conspiracy theories. Just questions that won't die, gaps in history that won't be filled, symbols carved in stone that no one alive can fully interpret, and treasure hunters still walking into the woods, looking for something that might not want to be found. Thanks for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's most persistent mysteries, please consider supporting the channel. Use those hype points. Leave that Spotify review. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. We genuinely love seeing where this content reaches, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a great time. We've got more stories like this coming, more gaps in history that need exploring, more questions that deserve to be asked. Until next time, sleep well. And if you're ever hiking in the Georgia wilderness and you see a stone with a turtle carved into it, maybe just keep walking. Some secrets have stayed buried this long for a reason. Good night.